The Spin-off Podcast Network.
This is Kiwi is back for a brand new season with more inspiring kōrero from special guests, including amputee, mum and wellbeing advocate Jess Quinn.
I'm most confident that I can get through almost anything. It doesn't mean that I nail it every time, but I am very confident I can overcome almost anything.
And musician, creative and content creator Taylor Roche.
I feel like big dreams always get challenged all the time, especially when you're doing something that's not traditional.
Listen to the new season of This is Kiwi, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in collaboration with KiwiBank. Available now wherever you get your podcasts. This is Kiwi is back for a brand new season with more inspiring kōrero from special guests, including rugby player, father and role model TJ Perenara.
My family bring me joy. Rugby brings me joy too, but it's not the same joy as my family brings me.
And global dancer and choreographer Kirsten Dodgen.
For some reason, people think I'm very intimidating.
Listen to the new season of This is Kiwi, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in collaboration with KiwiBank. Available now wherever you get your podcasts.
We're doing this so that we don't have to have me say the word and then cut it into every mention. Yes, in this week's podcast, I got it wrong. I flubbed it. I did a Christopher Luxon, and I called Koroneihana Koroneihia numerous times, so many times that there's no way to cut around it, according to Te Aia.
Have to do the whole podcast all over again.
So we're starting again. Let's roll.
Thanks, Ben. That's great.
Kia ora tātou, this is Gone by Lunchtime. My name's Toby Manhire. With me today, I hear Butler. How are you?
Kia ora, I'm well.
And also, Annabelle Lee-Mather.
Tēnā koe, kia ora.
And Ben Thomas.
Kia ora.
Very good. Now that we've got those formalities out of the way, everyone could just turn off their, silence their cell phones, and we'll get into it. Today on the agenda, there's a new poll, a new One News Varian poll, which we will exclusively reveal our interpretation of those results from. We might touch on the benefit sanction stuff that came in last week, I think. I should say, as a seasoned professional, that it's the 21st of August, Wednesday the 21st of August, and controversially we're recording this in the afternoon rather than the morning. But let's start off, shall we, with Koroneihana, Annabelle Lee-Mather, which is the Kingitanga annual coronation commemoration thingamajig. Is that about right? And it's not something I necessarily think is always a big party political deal, or am I wrong?
No, there's usually a day where all the politicians come on, so it's not unusual. It's not as high profile as Ratana because it falls in the middle of the year, but it's definitely political, and it's very iwi political as well.
And it was this time round, and we had Tuku Morgan on the Pai. I think did he talk about the government, the Luxon-led government throwing Māori under the bus, and that the government was a wrecking ball, or there was a wrecking ball image and under the bus being driven over.
Yeah, throwing them under the bus and then driving over them
with a wrecking ball, or maybe that was
And there was a ball on a bus.
A ball on a bus, and about Christopher Luxon quite notedly got up and said, in a sort of with a level of assertiveness that he hasn't before, that the National Party will not be supporting the Treaty Principles Bill beyond first reading. And he has sort of said that before, but it's been on the bridge run or in questioning on a radio interview. The fact that he came out and said that so directly seemed to amount to something. Shane Jones said the same on the part of New Zealand First.
Yeah, definitely the impression is that Luxon is keen to bury it, put it away, get it off the agenda, and Tūrangawaewae is a great place to do that. You know, all of the eyes and ears of Te Ao Māori are there, all the political reporters, all of that. And so I think that most people would have come away from that, on one hand, feeling relieved, but also still struggling with the fact that they'd support it for a first reading.
And Ben, there was some confusion around whether or not National might leave it sitting on the order paper, although that seems unlikely, which would leave it kind of lingering potentially into the next Parliament.
Oh, the second reading, yeah.
But the sort of bigger question, I guess, is this just something that happens in MMP government, that these kind of strange compromises are arrived at, which is the impression that Christopher Luxon is trying to give? Or should we reasonably be asking, why is this exercise? I mean, David Seymour has in the past lambasted what he calls gesture politics. This seems a lot like gesture politics. It's not going anywhere. Also, in terms of the minister in charge of essentially cutting down on government waste, doing something that seems fairly wasteful given there's no prospect of it going anywhere. And when you've got Christopher Luxon saying the priority for them is outcomes, whether they're in maths or reading, or sometimes the two are strangely combined in the same sentence, that maybe that would be better use of politicians' time to be working on changes that can have some effect rather than ones that are going to end up in a cul-de-sac.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, there was a recent court action which was unsuccessful about the government's proposed changes to the Marine and Coastal Area Act, the test for customary title, where they basically sought a judicial review of the government's consultation, sort of saying, well, the government has to go into this legislation with an open mind, but they've pretty much already decided it. They've said it in the coalition agreement what they're going to do. Consultation requires an open mind. And the court said, well, you don't need an open mind in politics. That's a... if you're doing a process under law, or if consultation is a requirement, yep, absolutely, these requirements exist. But political promises and bargains being what they are, you don't have to keep an open mind. And I think that's the sort of thing that Luxon would be saying to Seymour. Seymour, of course, ever the optimist, whether you take him at his face value or not, he says, well, they'll be convinced by the power of public support for this bill. They'll be convinced by what a good bill it is. You haven't even seen the bill yet. And I suppose that's a possibility, in his mind. He might think it's worth the shot. But of course, more aptly, it just delivers on something to his constituency. He said, we're going to fight for this idiosyncratic bill, which redefines the treaty as not really being about the treaty at all. You're left in this sort of uncomfortable situation. I mean, it's not unusual. It's actually a pretty well-known formulation. This certainly isn't the first time that coalition partners have said we'll support it, but only to the first reading. ACT had that for, I think, their regulatory something or other bill last time.
But have they outright said, have the other parties in the government outright said they won't back it thereafter, or only provided their backing up to that point?
It certainly hasn't. I think it certainly hasn't been asked as much. I think they have said we're only guaranteeing we'll provide support up to that point. That's my recollection of the previous national government. But and we've seen Seymour kick back on that in the past. Talking about is the Prime Minister violating the good faith requirements of our coalition agreement.
And in the last few days, Annabelle, he's said that it's disrespectful and anti-democratic for the other parties of the coalition to be signalling so clearly, and that, as Ben says, they should wait around and have an approach with an open mind the bill, which is presumably somewhere in an in tray at the Parliamentary Council office at the moment, getting refined. Maybe when it comes out, the principles as outlined will be different. Maybe there is. Do you think there is a possibility that this will get further traction, or is all of this just a big dance?
I think it's something that we're seeing happen more and more often in Parliament, and it's sort of something we touched on last week was 7AA. What's the point of going through a select committee process if you're wedded to a particular outcome? So I don't think it's that unusual. I think that the difficulty that Luxon has is that while he is very keen to dampen it all down, Luxon is just refusing to let go and on Twitter over the last few days, I've noticed that there's been a big flurry of treaty principle bill content coming out from the ACT website. I guess the difference...
Anything from the Mangere National Party or not on this particular
Not on the
issue?
Māori TV
Right.
Facebook page that I've seen recently.
Okay.
But I guess the difference with this and, say, a regulatory bill that doesn't get a second reading is the distrust, the upset, the hurt, the legal costs that this issue is, has caused. And, everywhere you go, Māori are talking about how race relations have been set back by decades because of it. So it's not the same as any other bill. This is a bill that really cuts to the heart of our nation, our identity, our treaty partnership. So the stakes are far higher than anything else. And I think it's unfortunate that it even got included in the coalition agreement in the first place. But clearly, Seymour never had any intention of letting it go.
Here's something I'm just going to put up for consideration, which is that I don't think that this is tactical. I don't believe in sort of 4D chess kind of things, or strategic rather. I don't think this is like a grand plot, of Luxon and Seymour working hand in glove. In fact, I think that the Prime Minister is probably very exasperated, by the rhetoric that's coming out. On the other hand, at Koroneihana on Monday, I think that Luxon was probably pretty pleased with how everything was reported, and I think he was pretty pleased that he had the Treaty Principles Bill to disavow and make that the headline coming out of it.
And ACT's absence is another part of it. Well, he fronted as it was,
Yeah, but I think, at the Koroneihana, he faced criticism from iwi leaders way, much greater than he's had in the past. Luxon in opposition did try and sort of, reach out to iwi. He's continued to sort of visit them in his first year. But I think there's been a real shift, which is the accretion of things like the Marine and Coastal Area Act amendments, the rhetoric around Te Reo Māori, obviously the treaty bill, the review of the treaty principles clauses, which is going ahead and has a much greater chance of sort of impinging on, sort of long-held Māori rights recognised by the courts, and things like, I think the other thing is that, Luxon has talked for a long time about, he's held those two things up as the sort of positive thing. Forget about Winston Peters, forget about David Seymour. Those are sideshows. The national government really wants, jobs and housing and success for Māori. He's talked about turbocharging iwi. He's had those conversations with King Tūheitia since before the election about how much his government is going to do for iwi on the front line. And I think that what's happening now is that, you're seeing all of these coalition commitments being delivered on for ACT and New Zealand First, and you haven't seen any of that sort of positive devolution, frontline services, whatever. All you've seen is, so far, they've announced the restructure of Te Arawhiti to cut some of its functions off and put them to TPK, who already have statutory functions to do those same jobs, and TPK was Te Arawhiti was created because TPK had failed at that so systematically and comprehensively over the years that the last government thought they had to start up a new agency, and there seems to be this sort of agenda, I guess, to turn, it seems, so early days, but that TPK, Te Puni Kōkiri, which really is one of the most derided sort of, the thick of it style government departments, when everybody thinks about underperforming, inept government departments full of waste, TPK is right up there. And the idea that it will somehow become this sort of engine room of doubling the Māori economy, of improving social outcomes for Māori, I mean, it's crazy. It's going back to the past. When you had an Indigenous employment office and things like that. And so what I think is that the mood has really soured within not just the more radical elements of Māoridom, but the ones who represent the sort of, I guess the sort of, the organised, the iwi sort of thing. And so I think Luxon would be very, very glad that he got away with a few headlines about the Treaty Principles Bill.
Right. So
it's interesting too, because when you listen to the kōrero on the pai, one of the topics that was most talked about and kept coming up over and over again was 7AA, like that, along with the treaty legislation, is what Māori are primarily focused on. And Rahui Papa, one of the King's speakers and advisors, said, if you come for our mokopuna, watch out. So that's very much at the forefront of what iwi are focused on. But like Ben says, for organisations like the Iwi Leaders Forum, the proposed changes to Te Arawhiti are just another source of frustration, particularly, if you're talking about, devolution, empowering Māori, helping iwi to, getting out of the way so that iwi can manage their own affairs. Clipping the wings of Te Arawhiti is the opposite of helping to achieve that.
And is there any sense that any of that is underway even in the early stages? Because it's all very well for it to suit Luxon this time around at this particular event to have a bunch of other distractions where the arrows are mostly aimed at coalition partners. But as time ticks on, if those sorts of services aren't devolved in the way that the more meaningful stuff is promised, that will become apparent, will it not?
Yeah, well, I think in healthcare, Lester Levy has talked about devolution quite a lot in his interviews about sort of, they call it restructuring, but it's really trying to give some structure to Health New Zealand, which has never had it since its inception. And Dr. Shane Reti, the health minister, has been very clear that he wants more responsibility in terms of actual sort of commissioning powers and funding to be with those independent Māori, iwi Māori partnership boards, IMPBs, that were set up under the Act. So sort of kind of changing their role a bit. And so that's, I think that iwi might see that that's a promising development, although a lot of those partnership boards aren't quite set up and they require a bit of cooperation regionally that might not be easy in all cases. But on the other stuff, in terms of the broader kind of devolution of sort of letting, I guess, iwi do decision making about how funds are spent, I'm not aware of anything. I think that that was sort of in the announcement about the restructure of Te Arawhiti and Te Puni Kōkiri, that was sort of that was kind of the seen as the rationale that that would be Te Puni Kōkiri would be playing this real role in developing Māori. But I mean that's a government department. That's not frontline services. So I'm not sure that they have a roadmap here.
Just coming back to Seymour, I feel like the issue that he faces now is one of optics, and it's that this is a politician, a political leader who has been talking about having debates and discussions about the treaty and its future and all of those things. But except for Waitangi, when those forums or discussions are being held in a Māori setting, he's a no-show. And I listened to Rahui Papa, again, who did an interview with Lisa Owen on Checkpoint, and he said very clearly that the invitation had been extended to ACT to attend Koroneihana, and they had actually received an email declining their invitation. And I do wonder if I would imagine that Seymour was probably expecting that Luxon and New Zealand First would stand and disavow the treaty bill principles legislation. And, you know, in my observations, it seems like since he's become a part of the coalition government, he's becoming increasingly brittle when it comes to criticism or other points of view. You know, if you look at the ACT Twitter account, they're like fighting with school teachers and that sort of stuff. And I wondered if Seymour felt that it would have been mana diminishing to sit on that paipai and have his coalition partners get up in front of him and in front of all of Te Iwi Māori and say, we will not be supporting his bill through to a second reading.
I mean, I guess from a very base political perspective, we saw in the lead up to the last election a bit of turf warfare on the part of both ACT and New Zealand First for the One New Zealand vote, for want of a better term. And from that perspective, not being present there, appearing on the news saying we've got important things to work on in Wellington, rather than just, you know, standing in the rain getting abused, that probably plays reasonably well.
Well, yeah. Look, it's not the audience that he's going for. You know, the potential voters that he's trying to woo with the Treaty Principles Bill and that, you know, all of that sort of rhetoric. You know, they're not going to be concerned that he dipped out on Koroneihana. So I don't think it's trying to send a message by not being there so much as, you know, he doesn't gain much by going, and it probably wouldn't be that pleasant an experience for him.
Which is ironic because if you actually watch what happened on the paipai, no one was abused. There was forthright, candid, open, honest, challenging conversations, which Māori welcomed in some of the most beautiful oratory you'll ever hear. And I, in particular, really enjoyed the whai kōrero by Justin Tipa, who is the new chair of Ngāi Tahu, who used the beautiful metaphor beseeching Luxon to hold on to the hoi of his waka, you know, his captain's position, and to not let it be taken by Seymour. But again, I think it's, you know, we need to be mindful when we talk about these discussions that happen on our paipai that we you know, frame them in the manner in which they were delivered. They weren't abusive or rude. They were exactly what people like Seymour have been calling for, which is open, honest, robust discussions. And some of those whai kōrero, if you get the chance, they're on YouTube. They're really fascinating and wonderful to listen to.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Christopher Luxon, meanwhile, had in the poll strengthened his. I mean, the poll things didn't move very much. They seem a bit sort of plateaued or steady, mostly since the election. But Christopher Luxon went up by 5%, admittedly only to 28%, but it's quite a good result for him given he'd been, you know, in the low 20s. Do you have any sense of why that is, Annabelle? Is it, I mean, when you look at the number for national, it's still higher than that. It's 38% steady. So maybe it's just National Party voters mostly getting used to that being their guy. I don't know. There's not a huge amount of movement in those polls to talk about beyond that.
To give Luxon credit, he's made some smart plays over the last few weeks. I think focusing on education at the National Party conference was one of them. Like when there's not a whole lot of great news to report in terms of the National Party's achievements thus far, besides from, you know, pretty humble tax cuts and that sort of thing, focusing on something like education, which the vast majority of New Zealanders care about, be they parents or grandparents, was a good move and made him seem more personable, more like an ordinary New Zealander who's thinking about the things that Kiwi families care about. So I think that was one of them, and I think probably has helped to keep his grow some support in what otherwise has been a pretty difficult year.
Ben, anything in that or elsewhere that struck you?
Yeah, no. Look, I think Annabelle's right that he's hit some good notes, particularly on education recently, but also the party has been racking up the delivery of promises. He has been very good at sort of almost like giving a speech, saying what you're going to say, saying it, and then telling people what you've just said. And that's the same, but with the legislative program. So I think the trust will be going up, and he's getting a bit of that sort of. He's convincing a few of the faithful, I think. And maybe National Party voters are sort of, warming up to him and not pining for John Key as much, or they saw John Key with him at the convention and were like, he's okay.
There have been a sort of trio of number gaffes. Nothing massive in the scheme of things, but he couldn't name the level of the benefit on RNZ. He got confused the size of the MSD added workforce. And then there was the press conference in Australia. There was that malapropism where he described 88% of Māori year 8s not being able to read, it became immediately following a mention of maths, which perhaps we'll get to in a second. But is that the sort of stuff that matters less to ordinary people than the critics such as us, Ben?
Yeah, look, I can't. In terms of the verbal flubs, I think people kind of price that in. I think it might have been Luke Malpass, said that, it is sort of a misfortune that he follows, two of the most fluent and best communicators that we've had as prime ministers, John Key and Jacinda Ardern. I think the media, those sort of flubs, especially with the amount of content there is these days, I think those sort of flubs have lost any kind of impact that they did have. And I think there is a distinction to be drawn, though, in terms of not being able to mention the benefit rate. Because we've seen that a few times. He couldn't name the superannuation allowance when he was announcing the superannuation policy in opposition. And I don't know this. If you believe Luxon and you believe, say, his first major speech as opposition leader, welfare reform is his political passion. It's the thing he got into government to do. It was the first thing he thought about when he became leader. And at no point between then and now was he really curious until he didn't know a Morning Report to find out what a benefit rate was. And whether that resonates with the public, we're in hard times now, and people are a little more attuned to beneficiary bashing when they're a bit more powerless about their own circumstances, which might be counterintuitive, but just seems to be how society works. But, especially, John Key, who I sort of understand, he really kind of thought in numbers. They were the kind of the points around which he sort of organised his thinking and his talking. And to just have that sort of, lack of command of the details, I'm not sure what it says, but it sort of gives you this idea that maybe the CE's chair is a little bit removed from what's happening in the firm. And I think it's something that he should really be sort of just brushing up on. It's sort of a cliche and a satirical thing, having these, cheat sheets of the price of milk and stuff. And I think everyone recognizes those as gotchas now. But, knowing about the benefit that you're, making reforms to, I think that's pretty core business.
Maybe he needs to turn up the laser. That was a joke about being laser focused, guys.
Right.
Should I have another go? Should I have another go at it?
It's too sophisticated.
I think at this point in the in the electoral cycle, people aren't laser focused on flubs like this. But like Ben says, I think it undermines his credibility as a guy who's supposed to be a numbers guy, when it comes to basic, the Māori maths thing and the statistics around that. It takes a little bit of effort to get in there and unpick those numbers if you're just a Joe Blogs kind of person. But finding out how much the benefit cost is a pretty easy Google search, and people will do that. So to not know something that kind of basic and fundamental to your platform policy, I think, does undermine. And again, as Ben says, it's kind of the big picture CEO kind of vibe, rather than you kind of leave those details to middle management.
Right, because when you make decisions or discuss policy changes, whether it's to do with tax cuts or whether you're addressing the impacts of inflation, that's a kind of building block, isn't it? Whereas milk is, comes in different forms, has benefit levels, but it's something that you shouldn't necessarily be having a sense of, even vaguely, when you're making those kind of calculations.
It's what the poorest New Zealanders are living on.
Right.
Yeah.
What the most vulnerable New Zealanders are living on, and whether or not it's enough to get by, and how that kind of factors into other things. On the maths point, which is kind of a stats point in a weird way, which is a form of maths. And I mean, I didn't understand this for a while when it was announced at the National Party conference, and then it was brought up again by Christopher Luxon in Australia last week, and he said reading instead of maths, which is hardly here or there, except that the statistic itself refers to Year 8's ability to meet the standards of a curriculum that is not yet in place, and the experts in this area are saying that it's actually the same as it has been for the last, I think, 15, 20 years. And that seems a bit tricky too, in that I don't think anyone would say it's fine. It's obviously a problem. But it has been, there's a little bit of lies, damn lies in statistics, and that I'm not sure that it's necessarily been presented in the most transparent fashion.
No, but again, I feel like it's kind of a smart move by Luxon, because, I think traditional National Party supporters feel quite proud of their party's track record with Māori when it comes to, settling big iwi and those sorts of things. It's sort of a badge of honour that work of people like Chris Finlayson and that sort of thing. And I think that, the aggressive approach this government has taken towards matters, Māori treaties, 7AA, all of those things, has hurt that. And so when traditional National Party supporters hear Christopher Luxon say, I'm really worried about Māori kids and how they're doing in maths, it kind of plays into that whole, up by your bootlaces kind of no handouts but a hand up kind of mentality that type of National Party supporter likes. It kind of takes the edge off the more prickly conversations that are happening at the moment. So I think politically it's quite smart, but is it an honest representation of what's actually happening in classrooms? I think most teachers would say that it's not.
I think it's interesting that, Chris Hipkins, came out essentially supporting Luxon, saying, because it was, I think the new curriculum was being developed under Labor, right?
It was, yeah.
And so the issue, I think the issue is not so much as, look at all these people who failed the test and then saying, well, the test isn't fair because they weren't taught the test. It's more, oh shit, once we finally got like a proper maths curriculum, with, it turns out the expectations we should have had were well below. And so there is a bit of sort of alarmism in it, sort of as if it's this recent decline, whereas I think anyone will tell you most people don't know any maths. I mean,
it's been bad. It's been bad, and it is a point that Luxon made in his speech announcing it, that he tried to suggest it was above politics, which might be a stretch, but implicit in that, and I think he even said that successive governments had not done enough for primary maths education, which seems beyond doubt. Still on benefits, the benefit sanctions theme came back into play last week, where Louise Upston went down into the Beehive basement and found the set of traffic lights that had last been used for the COVID settings, dusted them off and brought them up and applied them to the latest iteration of National Party benefit crackdown. And has that been about the headline crackdown sanctions? I mean, some of the main pieces about enforcing the existing sanctions more severely. The other bits are to do with money management, like having to have a card and those sorts of things. Louise Upson struggled to explain what happened to people who ended up, in the very sticky end of sanctions. But is this it's not Ruth Richardson level stuff, but is this more gesture politics?
No, I think it depends on how it's implemented. If you just look at the new rules as introduced, you could say, well, this, the things like the money management and the, community service? Like you've got to go do
community work experience. Yeah.
Yeah. If you miss your meeting, then you've got to go and find a shopkeeper in town, ask him to do a day's experience, and then you get up. I mean, I think the problem is that these people can't get jobs, right? Like, I don't think forcing them to go and, become unpaid interns is the solution.
Yeah, when your issue is that because of the whatever is going on in your life, you can't make a meeting. The idea that you're then going to go and do community work experience.
But not just that, like our current economic strategy is to raise unemployment levels to take the heat out of inflation. So it's like
that's right.
There's a contradiction between those two targets, isn't there?
I mean, the issue is it's really how it's enforced, and it becomes a cultural thing. Those new sanctions actually just they provide more flexibility than simply going straight to cutting, and so you could see them in that light as a positive thing. More bespoke service for each WINS customer, or whatever WINS is called now, MSD. But it's really about the culture. It's really about how sort of rigidly these rules are applied. And I think there was a piece on RNZ today about a recently out of work public servant who missed a meeting and then got his benefit cut off. Although that seems to have been an administrative error, because after pursuing it, he got paid back. But story, and when you say, people who can't get their lives together to attend a meeting, I think that probably includes a lot of public servants that look at a meeting scheduled and be like, it's probably not for anything. It's, I'll just work from home today. And, but
if it's on Zoom, I can crack on with something else at the same time.
Yeah.
I read that story too, and what it made me think is that if you're a public servant and you're used to dealing with ministries and all of that sort of stuff, and you're getting your benefit cut off for missing one meeting, and then you chase it up and chase it up and chase it up, and eventually your benefit gets put back on, that's terrible. But if you're not a person who has dealt with a whole lot of government ministries, and you don't necessarily have phone credit, and you've been laid off, and you haven't received your text, or you don't have petrol,
and you're behind on a bill,
transport.
So you've got a fine for the last bill and all that. Yeah.
What's happening to all of those guys? Because I imagine there's probably a lot more of them than there is public servants. It's just a sober reminder that, these things can be challenging for even educated people who have had good jobs and earned good money, let alone what it's like for, vulnerable workers.
Yeah, I think that's the really key point, and that's how you can really turn the screws. So the number of benefits being cancelled was up considerably this year already, without the traffic light system, and I'm guessing, but you would assume that that's because of sort of the reverse of what happened when Jacinda Ardern became Prime Minister, and there was sort of this memo sent out of well, we actually want you to be accommodating to to beneficiaries. We want you to try and help them and not try and find reasons to get them off to meet a target. So, this is one reason why, getting the targets right for what you're trying to achieve in public policy is very important, because, you can create these perverse incentives, where it's like, well, we don't want people on the dole. What will we do? We'll create a 50-page application form, which, as Christopher Luxon knows, many of our young people are unable to fill out properly, right? And so, so I think the cultural issue and how that's implemented will actually be more important than the specific changes that were made, to the rules.
All right. Well, on that upbeat note, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Annabelle. Thank you, Te Ai here. We will return soon.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.